I want to tell you something before I start. I've told this story maybe 40, 50 times, to admirals, to senators, to kids who think war is a video game and glory is something you just walk into. Every single time, I get through maybe the first 10 minutes and then somebody interrupts me. They want to talk about the fleet. They want to talk about the firepower. They want to talk about humanity rising up, about Earth flexing its muscles across the stars. And I get it, I do. That part is spectacular. It looks incredible on a screen. But that's not where this story starts. This story starts with a cry for help. It starts with fear. With something so desperate, so cornered, so out of options that they did what no civilization in this galaxy had ever done before. They called Earth. And they had to have known what that meant. My name is Commander Ria Vasquez. I was 37 years old when this happened. I commanded the UNS Threshold, a Vanguard-class deep recon cruiser, roughly 600 meters bow to stern, crew of 412. We weren't a warship, not primarily. We were a listening vessel. Our job was to sit out on the edge of known space and pay attention, cataloging signals, mapping gravity wells, recording background radiation shifts. The kind of work that sounds boring when you describe it at a party, and feels like a religion when you're actually doing it. We were stationed at the outer band of the Vega system on the 14th day of March, 2219. I was in my bunk. It was 300 ship time. I had a cup of cold coffee on my side table, and a novel I'd been trying to finish for 6 months open across my chest, and I was losing the battle against sleep for maybe the third time that night. My comm unit crackled. Then Lieutenant Dara Osai's voice came through, and the tone of it, I'd known Dara for 11 years, served with her on 3 postings, watched her stay steady through situations that would have broken other officers, and even she sounded strange. Careful, like she was carrying something made of glass. "Commander, you need to come to the bridge, now." That was all, no explanation, no we're detecting something, no you should see this, just now. I was on the bridge in 4 minutes. The Threshold's bridge was a semicircular room with a ceiling that curved up into a full environmental display dome, so at any moment the crew could look up and see exactly what was outside. Stars, nebulae, darkness. We called it the fishbowl, which was maybe not the most heroic name for the command center of a UEN cruiser, but it fit. When I stepped through the door, every station was occupied. That was unusual at 300, and every face was turned toward the main display screen at the front of the room. Nobody said anything for a second. Dara was standing at the signals console. She's a tall woman, Nigerian-British, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness about her that makes you feel calmer just being in the same room. She was not calm right now. "Tell me," I said. She played it. It came through the speakers first, this long, cycling pulse. Low and high frequencies layered on each other like 2 different voices trying to speak at the same time. It lasted about 40 seconds, went quiet for 10, then looped. And in the middle of it, woven into the carrier frequency like something hidden in the walls of a house, there were structured mathematical sequences, Fibonacci, prime progressions. And then something else. Something our systems hadn't fully decoded yet, but which the AI was flagging as probable distress language. Possible distress language, to be specific. "How long has this been broadcasting?" I asked. "We picked it up 22 minutes ago," Dara said, "but the signals aged. There's stellar drift in the frequency signature. This thing's been running for at least 6 days before we caught it." I looked at the origin point on the map. 17 light minutes from our position, deep inside the Vega system, not from a planet, from a point in open space, but one with a gravitational anomaly that suggested a large object nearby. Maybe a rogue body, maybe something artificial. "Is it natural?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "No," Dara shook her head, "definitely not natural." "Any language match in the database?" "No exact match, But the structural pattern is consistent with, she paused, chose her words, consistent with species we've encountered before, not hegemony dialect, not Vorthak, something else. Somebody at the back of the bridge made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I think it was Ensign Park. Doesn't matter. The point is that everyone in that room was feeling the same thing I was feeling, which was this strange cocktail of awe and fear, and something underneath both of those that felt almost like grief. Because if it was a distress signal, that meant someone out there was in trouble. And the trouble had been going on for 6 days before anyone heard them. I filed a priority report to UEN Central Command within the hour. The response took 9 minutes to come back, which was fast, which meant someone on duty back on Earth was paying very close attention. The response was brief. Threshold, you are authorized to investigate. Maintain safe observation distance. Do not transmit. Do not make contact. Observe and report. All data to be routed directly to UEN High Command, encrypted channel 7. I read it twice. Do not make contact. That's the order they gave me. I looked at Dara. She looked at me. We both knew what that meant. It meant command was worried. It meant they knew something we didn't, or suspected something we hadn't figured out yet. Do not transmit was standard protocol when you didn't want to advertise your position to whatever was out there. But do not make contact felt different. It felt like a warning. All right, I said, and my voice was steady because that's what commanders do. Let's go find out who's calling. It took us 6 hours at reduced thrust to close the distance while staying dark. No active sensors, no transponder ping. Just passive listening and slow, careful movement through the outer Vega band. The signal kept cycling. It didn't change. It didn't escalate or weaken. It just kept broadcasting, steady as a lighthouse, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had changed. A steady distress signal meant either the source was automated, a recording left behind after everyone was already gone, or the source was still there but couldn't transmit anything new, couldn't say anything else. Both of those possibilities kept me awake for those 6 hours. I sat in my command chair and I listened to the signal on low volume through a personal earpiece, and I cataloged the ways it sounded human, even though it wasn't. The rhythm of it, the way the pulses had pauses that felt almost like breaths. There was something plaintive in the frequency that wasn't just mathematical. It felt emotional, which I knew was probably my brain pattern matching against human speech, but I couldn't entirely shake it. Someone out there was scared. At 900 hours, our passive sensors resolved the object. It was a ship. Or what had been a ship. The silhouette on the passive scan was roughly elliptical, about 3 kilometers long, which was large even by hegemony standards. The hull was intact at the bow, but the aft section had been catastrophically damaged. Not explosion damage. Something had cut through it. Long, clean slices through dense hull plating, spaced with a precision that made the damage look almost methodical. Dara put the scan image on the main screen, and we all looked at it. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Ensign Park, who was young, 24 years old, this kid from Incheon who'd only been on the threshold for 7 months, said, quietly, "They went through the engine section." He was right. Whoever had attacked that ship had specifically targeted propulsion. The drive section was gone, not just damaged, surgically removed, taken out in a way that left the rest of the ship floating but completely, utterly unable to move. "They wanted survivors," Dara said. The words sat in the room like something heavy. I contacted command again, sent the scan data, waited. The response came back in 4 minutes. Confirmed unknown vessel, non-human registration. Maintain position. Stand by for further orders. High Command is convening. High Command is convening. On a Saturday morning, at 9:12 ship time, UEN High Command was being pulled into an emergency meeting because of what we were looking at. I took the earpiece out, set it on the arm of my chair, looked at the screen. I want a linguistic team on that signal, I said. Full analysis. I want to know if there's information in the looping pattern we've missed. And I want structural integrity estimates on that vessel. I need to know if it can hold atmosphere. Why? Dora asked. Because if it can hold atmosphere, I said, then there are people inside it. Part 2. What was left? There were people inside it. 41 of them. We figured that out by mid-afternoon, not by going over there, not yet, because Command had not authorized approach, and I wasn't going to override that order without very good reason. We figured it out by listening. The passive thermal sensors on the threshold were designed for deep space work, for reading temperature variations in stellar objects, and they were extraordinarily sensitive. At close range, pointed at that wrecked ship, they could detect the heat signatures of living bodies clustered in the forward sections. 41 heat signatures. Clustered together, in the undamaged section near the bow, which meant they knew where the atmosphere was holding and they'd retreated to it. 41 survivors on a 3-kilometer ship. I spent about 30 seconds doing math I didn't want to do. A ship that size crew of what, 200, 300, and 41 left. Whatever had attacked them had been thorough. Dara came and stood next to my chair. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, what are we going to do? We're going to wait for orders, I said. How long? As long as it takes. She nodded, but she didn't go back to her station. She just stood there, and I understood why, because I was feeling the same thing. There's a particular kind of helplessness that comes from being close to suffering and not being able to do anything about it. We'd been in this system for 6 days after that signal started and we hadn't known. Someone had been sitting in a wrecked ship for 6 days, transmitting and waiting, and for 6 of those days there was no one close enough to hear. And now we were here, and we were watching, and we were waiting for bureaucrats sitting in comfortable rooms on Earth to tell us what to do. The signal kept cycling. At 13:47, Command sent a message that changed everything. Not the authorization to make contact. That didn't come for another 2 hours. No, what came at 13:47 was a priority intelligence briefing, reclassified for distribution to my command level, and what it told me required me to sit down in the middle of reading it, which is not something I do. The ship we were looking at, the wrecked, drifting, surgically disabled ship with 41 living survivors aboard, was registered to a species called the Ventai. I hadn't heard of them. Most people in the UEN hadn't. They were a mid-level civilization, as the hegemony measured these things. 1 home world, 3 colony systems, roughly 4 billion people spread across their territory in the outer arm of the galaxy. Reasonable technology, not aggressive, known in the hegemony records as traders and engineers. The kind of species that kept to themselves, did their work, paid their hegemony tithes, and stayed out of galactic politics. Except that 6 weeks ago the hegemony had levied a new tithe, a massive one, something the Ventai couldn't pay. And when they'd protested, formally, legally, through every correct diplomatic channel, the hegemony had sent a fleet to make the point that protest was not something the hegemony tolerated. The ship we were looking at was a Ventai diplomatic vessel. It had been carrying a delegation to the hegemony's nearest administrative station, trying to negotiate. The hegemony's border enforcement fleet had intercepted them here, in Vega. And this wrecked, drifting, silent ship with 41 people alive inside it was the message. Pay up or this is what happens. I read it twice. Then I read it a 3rd time because I needed my hands to stop shaking before I stood up. The Vega system was technically unclaimed territory, neutral space. It wasn't Earth's jurisdiction. It wasn't the hegemony's jurisdiction either, technically, though the hegemony had a way of making, technically, mean very little in practice. But we were here. And they were here. and 41 people had been broadcasting for 6 days. The authorization to make contact came at 16:03. I had a speech prepared. I'm not joking. I had actually written down what I was going to say, which I almost never do, because I knew that whatever we sent was going to be the first human communication these people had ever received, and I wanted to get it right. I wanted it to not be corporate, not bureaucratic, not greetings from the United Earth Nations. We represent a Class 3 civilization. What I sent was simpler than that. I had Dara set up a tight beam transmission on a frequency adjacent to their distress signal, so they'd know we'd been listening, we'd heard them. I waited for the signal to complete one of its cycles, and then I keyed my comm and I said, "This is Commander Ria Vasquez of the United Earth Nations ship Threshold. We received your signal. We are here. We are not your enemy. Please respond." Then I waited. 54 seconds. The longest 54 seconds I've ever sat through. And then the signal changed. The cycling stopped. The looping distress frequency broke off mid-pattern. And in its place, overlaid on our transmission frequency, clearly an attempt to use our own signal as a carrier, which told me right away that whoever was answering was smart and technically capable even after 6 days in a crippled ship, came a voice. It wasn't human, but it was clearly a voice. It had rhythm and variation and emphasis. It sounded like, I've tried to describe this before and I always get it slightly wrong. It sounded like if you took wind chimes and gave them syntax. There were clicking components, resonant tones, something that might have been vowels or might have been harmonics. I genuinely couldn't tell. But underneath all of it was an unmistakable quality. Desperation. Relief. I looked at Dara. "Get me linguistics," I said. "Right now." Dr. Emeka Fatland ran our linguistics team. He was 53 years old, from Lagos, the kind of academic who wore the same 2 sweaters in rotation, and had 7 opinions about syntax that he would share with you whether you asked or not. He was also, without question, the most brilliant person on the threshold, and he knew it. And he decided somewhere along the line that knowing it meant he didn't have to bother with pretense. He came to the bridge in the sweater with the elbow patches and a tablet full of notes, and he listened to the response for 38 seconds without blinking. Then he said, "They're using our transmission as a structural frame. They're building around it, using human phoneme patterns as anchoring points and substituting their own sounds in the semantic slots." "In English," I said. "They're translating in real time," he said, "or trying to. Whatever their universal language technology is, it's sophisticated. Within about 4 exchanges, they'll probably have enough of our phoneme map to produce something recognizable." He paused. "They're scared, and they're working very hard not to sound scared." "How do you know they're scared?" "Tempo," he said simply. "Their natural speech rate is being suppressed. They're controlling it. That's what you do when you're frightened and you need the other person to stay calm." I thought about that for a moment. This alien in a crippled ship, 6 days stranded, 41 survivors, and they were worried about our reaction. "Respond," I said. "Keep it simple. Tell them we've received. Tell them we want to help." 4 exchanges. Emeka was exactly right. By the 4th transmission, the voice on the other end was producing something we could parse. Not English. It wasn't close to English phonetically, but the structure had adapted. Subject-verb-object, tonal emphasis on key concepts, repetition of critical words across multiple transmissions to build a shared vocabulary in real time. The entity on the other end of that signal was an ambassador. That's what the word resolved to, ambassador, or the Ventai equivalent, which carried the same weight. Someone empowered to speak for their people, bound by the same codes of truth and representation that human ambassadors are bound by. Her name was Verathis, or that's what it resolved to in our translation matrix. She'd been on the diplomatic delegation. She'd survived because she'd been in the forward section of the ship for a meeting when the attack happened. She'd watched through the viewport as the hegemony ships completed their work on the aft section. She'd watched the other Ventai survivors be. The word she used was one Emeka translated as gathered, which in context clearly meant taken. Taken alive. As leverage. She had 41 people. She was the most senior surviving official. She had been broadcasting for 6 days because she didn't know what else to do. And then she said something that stopped all of us. She said, and Emeka refined this translation 3 times before we were confident in it, she said. We did not signal to your kind expecting rescue. We signaled because we expected to die and we wanted someone to know. We wanted a record. We did not know you would come. I had to leave the bridge for about 4 minutes after that. I went to the corridor just outside. I stood with my back against the wall and I looked at the ceiling and I breathed. When I came back, my face was under control. Tell her we're not here to make records, I said. Tell her we're here to help. Part 3, the hegemony arrives. They came on the 2nd day. I'd expected it sooner, honestly. If the hegemony's border enforcement fleet had been monitoring their own attack site, which any competent military force would do, they'd have detected our presence within hours. But it was 31 hours after we'd made contact with the threshold when the gravitational sensors lit up. 3 ships. Hegemony enforcement cruisers. I knew the silhouette. They were purpose-built enforcement vessels, not explorers, not traders, not diplomats. They were the tool the hegemony used when they wanted to emphasize a point. Each one was about 800 meters long, heavily armed by any standard I'd ever seen, and crewed by a species called the Vorthek that the UEN's xenobiology files described as biologically inclined toward hierarchical aggression, which was a polite way of saying they were very good at hurting things. 3 of them, versus 1 deep recon cruiser with scientific equipment and a crew of 400. They came in on an intercept vector, and they didn't bother hailing us first, which told me immediately what kind of conversation this was going to be. When they finally did hail, about 20 minutes after we first detected them, the transmission was in hegemony standard, which the threshold had translation software for. The voice was mechanical, flat, translated through 3 layers flat, but the message was perfectly clear. Unidentified Earth vessel. You are operating in a secured enforcement zone. Your presence is unauthorized. You will withdraw immediately to a distance of no less than 12 light minutes from this location. Failure to comply will result in punitive measures. This is your only notification. That was it. 1 transmission. No pleasantries, no questions, no curiosity about why we were there or what we'd found. That last part was the tell, actually. They didn't ask what we were doing there, because they already knew what we were doing there. They knew about the Ventai ship and they wanted us away from it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I keyed the response channel. Hegemony enforcement cruisers, this is Commander Ria Vasquez, United Earth Nations ship threshold. We are conducting a distress response in accordance with the Galactic Maritime Emergency Accords, Article 17, Subsection 4, which mandates that any vessel capable of rendering aid to a ship in distress is legally bound to do so regardless of territorial designation. We are in compliance with Accord law. We will not withdraw. I assented. Dara looked at me. Did we just cite galactic maritime law at 3 warships? She asked. Yes, we did, I said. Do they care about galactic maritime law? Probably not, I said, but it goes in the record. The hegemony's response was to close the distance. Not aggressively, not weapons hot, not an attack vector, but they moved. From 12 light minutes to 8, then to 4. They spread out as they came, creating a triangle formation around us and the Ventai ship, and they used their sensor systems actively, which is the interstellar equivalent of shining a spotlight in your face. Visible, intentional, a demonstration. We see you, we can reach you, do what you're told. The crew of the Threshold was scared. I knew that. I could feel it in the way the bridge had gone quiet, in the way people were moving with that careful, deliberate effort that comes from not wanting to betray how frightened you are. 412 people were looking to me, and what I did in the next hour was going to matter enormously. I sent another message to command. This one was different from the previous updates. This one said, 3 hegemony enforcement cruisers on site, active sensor lock. No direct threat yet, but posture is hostile. We are maintaining position per Article 17. Request clarification on rules of engagement. The response came back in 11 minutes. Threshold, maintain position. Rules of engagement remain non-hostile. You are not authorized to initiate contact with hegemony vessels beyond communication. Stand by. Stand by. There's a version of this story where I resent that order, where I stand here and tell you command was being cautious and slow and political, while real people were in danger. But that's not honest. The truth is that an unreconstructed shoot-first response from a single recon cruiser against 3 enforcement vessels wasn't going to save the Ventai. It was just going to add 400 human names to the casualty list. Sometimes stand by is the correct call. Sometimes. I keyed the internal shipwide comm. This is the commander. As of now, we are in a tense standoff situation with 3 hegemony vessels. No weapons have been raised. No threat has been made beyond proximity intimidation. We will maintain our position. We will continue supporting the Ventai survivors. Every person on this ship will do their job with professionalism and calm. That is all. Then I turned to Dara. Keep that channel to the Ventai open, I said quietly. Make sure they know we're still here. She nodded once. And tell Dr. Fatund I want him talking to Ambassador Verathis constantly. Not for information. Just keep her talking. Let her hear a human voice. The standoff held for 18 hours. 18 hours of sitting in the fishbowl with 3 hegemony warships sitting at the corners of a box they'd drawn around us. 18 hours of passive sensor monitoring, of watching them watch us, of crew rotations and meal breaks, and the small mundane business of a ship continuing to function, while everyone aboard was quietly and thoroughly terrified. The hegemony sent 2 more messages during that time. The first came at hour 7. Same flat, translated tone. Earth vessel, you were warned. Your continued presence constitutes a violation of hegemony administrative authority in this sector. Your vessel registry and command signature have been recorded. There will be consequences. I logged it and didn't respond. The second came at hour 15. This one was different. The tone was the same, but the content had changed. Earth vessel. The Ventai life forms aboard the damaged vessel are not your concern. They are detained parties under hegemony judicial process. Your interference in a judicial proceeding constitutes a hostile act. You are advised to withdraw or be considered a party to the proceedings. That was new. Detained parties, not survivors, not distress victims, detained parties under judicial process. They were trying to frame the 41 survivors as criminals, recontextualizing the attack as a legal proceeding. If that framing held, if any neutral galactic body or recorder accepted it, then the Ventai could be taken, and anyone who'd interfered in their legal detention could be sanctioned. It was a sophisticated move, and it told me that whoever was making decisions on those 3 ships was not just muscle. They were thinking about the political and legal aftermath. They were worried about documentation. Good, let them be worried. I sent the message to command verbatim with my own assessment. Hegemony attempting to establish legal framing for what appears to be unprovoked attack on civilian diplomatic vessel. This is a strategic document play. Recommend UEN Legal Division engage immediately. Then I went back to waiting. Hour 17. Dara came to my chair very quietly. She leaned close and spoke low, so only I could hear. "Commander," she said, "passive sensors are picking something up on the far edge of the system." "New contacts?" I asked. "Yes," she said, "many." Something in her voice, that same careful quality from the first night on the bridge, made me keep my expression completely neutral as I turned toward the sensor display. Many was an understatement. The passive read was still resolving, still building a picture from the faint gravitational and electromagnetic traces at extreme range. But even at this distance, even with the data still coming in, I could see what it meant. A fleet. A large fleet. Moving into the Vega system from the direction of Earth. I sat very still for a moment. Then I pulled up Command's last communication to me, "Stand by," and I looked at the timestamp. 11 hours ago. They'd said stand by 11 hours ago. And for 11 hours, something had been moving. Part 4, the fleet. They resolved over the course of about 40 minutes. The passive sensors built the picture piece by piece, first the gravitational shadow, then the electromagnetic signatures, then the silhouettes. And as each piece came in, the bridge of the threshold got quieter and quieter, until by the time the full picture was assembled, I could hear the ventilation system. 27 ships. 27 United Earth Nations vessels, spanning the full spectrum of the modern UEN Navy. At the front running point were the 3 Leviathan-class dreadnoughts, the Unbroken, the Meridian, and the Soul. Each one was just under 2 kilometers long, with a hull profile that looked like someone had taken a mountain and decided to make it move. They were the heaviest capital ships the UEN had. There were only 7 in existence. 3 of them were here. Behind them, 2 columns of Titan-class battlecruisers, 6 ships, 900 meters each, carrying enough firepower to crack a moon. Then the Paladin-class heavy cruisers, 8 of them, escort configuration. Then the Spear-class destroyers, fast, 12 in total, positioned at the flanks and running an envelope formation around the heavier ships. And woven through all of it, barely visible on passive scan because they were actively suppressing their own signatures, at least 4 Wraith-class stealth destroyers doing what Wraith-classes did, being exactly where you didn't expect them. 27 ships. The UEN had sent 27 ships. I looked at that picture for a long time. Then I started to understand what those 11 hours of standby had actually been. Command had been moving, not deciding, moving. The fleet had already been in transit when they told me to wait. They'd known within hours of my first report that this situation wasn't a standoff a recon cruiser should handle alone. And they hadn't told me because if the hegemony had intercepted a transmission about an incoming fleet, the political situation would have become unmanageable before the fleet arrived. So they'd moved quietly. And now they were here. The internal comm buzzed. An incoming priority channel request, routed through the secure command network. I put on my headset. "Threshold, this is Admiral Kenji Matsumoto aboard the Unbroken. Report." Admiral Matsumoto. I knew the name. Everyone in the UEN knew the name. He'd commanded the Second Fleet during the Rigel Station crisis 7 years ago. He was 71 years old, small and precise, with a reputation for absolute stillness in crisis situations. The kind of stillness that isn't calm, it's the thing that controls calm. I reported everything. The signal, the survivors, the Venthai ship, the hegemony cruisers, the 18 hours of standoff, the legal framing attempt in the last hegemony message. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief pause. "You did well, Commander," he said. "Hold position, we'll take it from here." The 3 hegemony enforcement cruisers had detected the incoming fleet. Of course they had. Passive sensors on a modern warship at their proximity would have resolved the fleet well before my own sensors had. They'd been watching those blips build and resolve for the same 40 minutes I had. I don't know what was said among their command structure. I don't know what communications went back and forth between those three ships and whatever hegemony administrative authority they answered to. I can only tell you what we observed. They went weapons hot. Not pointed at us. That was notable. The weapons weren't aimed at the threshold or at the Ventai ship. They were oriented toward the incoming fleet. Which was a decision. A choice. 3 enforcement cruisers going weapons hot against 27 UEN warships, including 3 dreadnoughts, was not a military calculation. No sane tactical mind was looking at those numbers and thinking, we win this. So it wasn't about winning. It was about posture, about signaling that the hegemony didn't back down, about making the UEN fire the first shot, or at least create a situation where the aftermath was ambiguous. They wanted an incident. They wanted the record to show something other than what it was. I forwarded the sensor data to the Unbroken immediately. 6 minutes later, Admiral Matsumoto's voice came back over the command channel. I see it, he said, dry, calm, like he was discussing the weather. What happened next was one of the most deliberate pieces of theater I've ever witnessed. The UEN fleet did not accelerate. They maintained their exact incoming vector, same speed, same formation. They didn't spread into attack configuration. They didn't run weapons hot. They came in exactly as they'd been traveling, organized, steady, enormous, and they arranged themselves in the Vega system like they owned it. Not aggressively, just completely. The 3 dreadnoughts positioned themselves between the hegemony cruisers and the Ventai ship, close enough that the sheer mass of them would have been visible on any passive sensor as a clear geometric statement. You cannot reach that ship without going through us. The Titan-class battle cruisers fanned out into a holding line. The destroyers went to escort positions around the threshold. The Wraith classes vanished from the sensors entirely, which didn't mean they went away. It meant they went somewhere the hegemony couldn't track. And through all of it the fleet ran cold, no weapons active. Nothing pointed anywhere, just mass and arrangement, and the very clear implication that anyone who wanted to make trouble in this system was going to have a deeply educational experience. Admiral Matsumoto then sent a hail to the hegemony cruisers. I wasn't on that channel. It was command-level diplomatic communication, above my clearance in the moment. But Dara pulled the transmission metadata, and the exchange lasted 19 minutes. 19 minutes of back and forth, translated through multiple systems, between the most decorated flag officer in the UEN Navy and whoever commanded those 3 enforcement ships. When it was over, the hegemony ships went cold. Weapons down. They didn't leave. They held position still inside the system, but the weapons were down. I let out a breath I'd been holding for about 18 hours. Part 5, the work. Here's the part of the story that people gloss over. The fleet arrived, the hegemony backed down, and then nothing dramatic happened. No battle, no explosions, no heroic last stand. Instead, there were 14 days of work. Hard, careful, slow work. The first job was the Ventai survivors. Medical teams from the Meridian, which carried a full medical facility, suited up and crossed to the damaged ship in a series of shuttles over 8 hours. The forward section was holding atmosphere, but barely. There were 3 separate breaches that the survivors had been patching with whatever materials they had on hand. One of the survivors, a young Ventai engineer, had been manually maintaining a critical pressure valve for the last 3 days without sleeping because if she stopped, the section lost air. She had to be physically carried out. 41 survivors, 11 critical, 7 who'd been injured in the initial attack and had been receiving care from a Ventai medic with very limited supplies for 6 days. Ambassador Verathis walked out under her own power. She was taller than I'd expected from her voice, though I don't know why I'd expected anything from a voice. She had 6 limbs, the upper 2 used for manipulation, the lower 4 for locomotion. Her surface, I couldn't call it skin exactly, was a deep iridescent blue that shifted toward green at the extremities. Her eyes were large and dark and set wide, and they processed light differently than human eyes do, so when she looked at something her gaze had a quality of absoluteness, like she was taking in the whole thing at once. She came down the boarding ramp with 2 of her people helping a third, and she stopped at the bottom, and she looked around. She looked at the UN ships, she looked at the shuttles, she looked at the medical teams in their suits, she looked at the threshold, still there, still in its position. And then she looked at me. I don't know how she knew it was me. Maybe Emeka had described me during his conversations with her, or maybe she could distinguish individual humans better than I could distinguish individual Venti. But she looked at me specifically, and she raised the upper right limb in a gesture that our cultural database flagged as significant, palm outward, slight angle downward. Emeka, standing at my elbow, said quietly, "That's the gesture you make to someone who stayed." I didn't know what to do with my hands. I raised one, open palm, trying to mirror something like the gesture back. She held it for a moment. Then she let it fall, and the Venti delegation was escorted to medical care, and we had 41 people to look after. The second job was the diplomatic and legal work, which was even harder. I was not involved in most of that. It happened at levels above mine, in secure communication channels between the Unbroken and both the Hegemony Administrative Authority and various neutral galactic bodies. But the broad strokes filtered down to me through official briefings. The Hegemony tried the legal framing. They filed documentation with the Galactic Records Authority, claiming the Venti ship had been stopped as part of an authorized debt enforcement action. They produced a tithe notification, legally generated, formally issued, and argued that the ship's damage was the result of compulsory immobilization rather than attack, and that the missing crew members were held as collateral rather than taken. The UEN's legal team, working from the Unbroken's communications facility, filed a counterargument that was apparently 73 pages long and cited 118 precedents from galactic accord law. I saw exactly one paragraph of that document, and it was not written for casual reading. But the important thing was that it was filed. Every transmission went into the record. Every counterclaim was documented. Every piece of evidence from the threshold sensor logs and communication archives was preserved and submitted. The Hegemony had wanted this to disappear. They'd wanted the Venti ship to drift until it couldn't drift anymore, wanted the 41 survivors to either give up or be collected quietly, wanted no inconvenient witnesses and no messy documentation. We had been inconvenient witnesses for 6 days. And now there were 27 UEN ships worth of documentation. On the 9th day, the 3 Hegemony enforcement cruisers left. They didn't announce it. They just changed their vector and began moving out of the system, slow and steady, the same way they'd come in. No final hail, no acknowledgement, just gone. The Venti crew members who'd been taken, we learned through back-channel diplomatic contact that 147 of them were being held at a Hegemony processing facility 2 systems away. Those were the subject of ongoing negotiations. That part wasn't resolved in the Vega system. It went on for another 4 months. But they were returned, eventually all of them. It took political pressure and legal filings and 3 separate galactic mediations, and at one point a UEN trade policy lever that I don't fully understand. But they came home. I wasn't there for that part. On the 12th day, Ambassador Verathis requested a conversation. Not through the translation systems. In person. She'd been working with Emeka's team since her arrival on the Meridian, and her grasp of human speech had progressed in a way that had left Emeka unusually quiet, which for Emeka meant he was very, very impressed. We met in a small conference room aboard the Meridian. Just the two of us and Emeka, who sat to the side as both translator and recording witness. The room had a viewport, and the Vega system's primary star was visible in it, big and orange and close enough that it wasn't just a point of light. She sat across the table from me. She was in a recovery garment the Meridian's medical team had fabricated for her, dark blue, close-fitting, designed based on Ventai textile records from the xenobiology database. Her color had improved. When she'd come off that ship she'd been pale, the blue in her surface washed out toward gray. Now she was vivid again. She looked at me for a moment in that complete way she had. Then she said, in something approaching English, halting but clear, "Why did you stay?" I didn't answer immediately. It wasn't that I didn't know what to say. It was that I wanted to say the right thing. And the right thing wasn't the official answer. Wasn't we were acting in accordance with Galactic Maritime Emergency Accords Article 17. That was true, but it wasn't the answer she was asking for. "Because you called," I said finally. "You were there, we heard you. What else were we going to do?" She was quiet for a moment. "Many would have gone," she said, "when the other ships came." "I know," I said. "You did not." "No." She made a sound I didn't have a word for. Not quite the clicking resonance of her natural speech, and not quite human. Something in between. Emeka later told me he thought it was the closest thing to a sigh that Ventai physiology produced. "In 6 days," she said carefully, "I was certain we would die. I decided the signal was my last act, a record. To say that we were here, that this happened, that someone should know." She paused. "I did not expect to be speaking to you." I didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm glad you were wrong," I said. She looked at the star in the viewport. "Your people," she said, "your fleet," she seemed to search for the word. "We have no experience of your kind before this. We knew the name Earth humans, but at the periphery only, a young species, small by hegemony categorization." She turned back to me. "We did not know." "To be fair," I said, "neither did the hegemony." Emeka made a small noise from the corner that might have been a suppressed laugh. Verathis tilted her head in a way that I'd come to recognize as the Ventai equivalent of a smile. Part 6. What the fleet meant. On the 14th day, I finally got to sit down with Admiral Matsumoto. Not a comm channel. In person, in his quarters aboard the Unbroken. He'd sent an invitation through proper channels, which meant a formal request drafted by his aide, and I'd dressed in a clean uniform and taken the shuttle across and been escorted through corridors that made the threshold feel like a student apartment. The Unbroken was 2 kilometers long, and it felt like it. Everything about it was large in a way that seemed to exist not for practical reasons, but to make a point. The bulkheads were wider than they needed to be. The ceilings were higher. The corridors were lit to a specific blue-white spectrum that made you feel, without being able to say exactly why, that something important was happening. Admiral Matsumoto's quarters were comparatively simple: a work table, a wall of screens showing various system readouts, a viewport looking out at the Vega system, 2 chairs. He was smaller than I'd imagined from the voice, which I always find strange with people I've only spoken to through communication systems. He had the stillness I'd heard about, not the stillness of a man who doesn't feel things, but of a man who has had 71 years to decide what to do with what he feels. He poured tea, actual tea, hot in ceramic cups, which on a starship is a choice. We drank it and looked at the viewport for a minute before either of us said anything. "You did good work out here," he said. "The legal documentation, the communication record, that matters." "The fleet mattered more," I said. He shook his head slightly. "The fleet arrived because of the documentation. We needed to know what we were walking into. Your 6 hours of careful approach, your 18 hours of holding position, that gave us what we needed to make the case that this was worth the deployment." He set his cup down. This didn't happen the way it did by accident, Commander. The hegemony chose this system for a reason. They thought it was remote enough that the Ventai ship would be unobserved. They miscalculated. You were here. I almost wasn't, I said. We almost dismissed the signal. The system parameters suggested it might be natural phenomenon. But you didn't dismiss it. Dara didn't dismiss it, I said. Lieutenant Osai, she woke me up. She said now, not when you have a minute. He nodded as if that was the expected answer. Good people, he said. That's what it usually comes down to. I thought about that. Admiral, I said. 27 ships, 3 dreadnoughts. That's a significant deployment for a situation in neutral space involving a species we had no prior treaty relationship with. He picked up his tea again, considered it. The Ventai aren't the only ones, he said. The way he said it made me hold very still. There are 11 other cases, he said, in the last 8 years. 11 situations where the hegemony applied enforcement pressure to smaller civilizations in ways that fell just short of the legal threshold for accord violation. 11 cases where, by the time anyone filed documentation and galactic bodies considered responding, the situation had been resolved by attrition. He looked at me. Resolved by attrition means people died or gave up or disappeared into hegemony processing facilities. I set my cup down. We know this has been happening, he said. We've known for years. We've been building a case, legal, political, diplomatic, but cases take time, and while we build them, the hegemony takes another bite. He looked back at the viewport. When your signal came in, the case for deployment was already made. We'd been ready for 2 months. We were waiting for an incident where we could be justified, documented, and early enough to matter. He paused. You got there first, he said, and you stayed. That made all of this possible. I thought about something Verathis had said. We did not know. The hegemony hadn't known either. They'd looked at humanity through their categorization system, young species, small by galactic standards, Class 3 civilization, pre-hegemony contact development level, and they'd made an assumption about what that meant. They'd assumed it meant manageable, containable, impressed by the apparatus of galactic power. They'd been wrong. I've thought about why they were wrong in the years since, what it is about humans that the hegemony's categorization didn't capture. And I've come to think it's something simple, and also something very hard to quantify. Humans are extraordinarily bad at deciding that something is not their problem. We are constitutionally incapable of hearing a cry for help and walking away. I don't say that as a point of pride exactly. It's gotten us into tremendous trouble historically. But in this case, in a damaged ship in the Vega system, with 41 survivors and 3 enemy cruisers, and nothing but a recon vessel between them and whatever came next, it was exactly the right flaw to have. Part 7, Aftermath. I stayed in the Vega system for another 3 weeks after the fleet arrived. Part of that was practical. The threshold had a role in the ongoing salvage and documentation work. Our sensor arrays were useful. We knew the terrain. Part of it was that I wasn't ready to leave yet, though I wouldn't have said that out loud. The Ventai survivors were transferred to a UEN transport vessel that would carry them to neutral space and eventually home. There were 14 days between their evacuation from the damaged ship and their departure from the system, and during that time I had several conversations with Verathis. She was a remarkable person. Ventai, not person, but I find I keep defaulting to person when I think about her, which I think she would find amusing and also correct. She was diplomatic in a way that wasn't just professional, it was constitutive. The way some people are musicians or teachers. She saw relationships as the work, the negotiation and the tending and the careful attention to how one party understands another. 6 days in a wrecked ship hadn't broken that. It had maybe sharpened it. She told me about the Ventai, in fragments and sessions across those 14 days. Their world, tidally locked, one hemisphere always facing their star, the habitable band around the Terminator line where the temperature was survivable. Their society organized in concentric rings around that Terminator, with transportation networks running the circumference of the planet. They were traders because their world produced very specific rare minerals, and traders because their temperament was suited for it, and diplomats because they'd learned early that being good at talking was better than being good at war. "We were not built for this," she said once in one of our conversations. She gestured at everything, the ships, the situation. "We are built for conversation. We thought conversation would be enough." "It usually is," I said. "Not with the hegemony." "No," I agreed, "not with the hegemony." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it enough with you?" she asked. "With humans is conversation." "I hope so," I said. "We're trying." She looked at me with those wide, absolute eyes. "Trying is significant," she said. The Ventai diplomatic ship was eventually recovered and towed to a UEN facility for analysis and repair. The data from it, the records of the hegemony attack, the exact documentation of what had been done to the aft section, the communications logs the Ventai crew had maintained during the siege, all of that went into the galactic record. All of it was filed. All of it was preserved. The hegemony contested it. Of course they did. They filed 17 separate challenges to the documentary record over the following 2 years. They lost all 17. I know this because Emeka kept track and sent me a message every time one was dismissed. Just a short note. The same note every time. 17-0. The crew of the Threshold. I want to talk about them for a minute because history tends to flatten things. When you tell a story about a fleet arriving, the fleet is what people remember. The 27 ships, the dreadnoughts, the firepower. But for 18 hours before any of that, it was 412 people on a deep recon cruiser with scientific instrumentation and a library of xenobiology databases, sitting between 3 enemy warships and a crippled diplomatic vessel, and not moving. Ensign Park, the kid from Incheon, he was 24 years old and he manned the sensor station for 15 of those 18 hours without taking a break. He said afterward that he'd been afraid the whole time. He just decided that being afraid and doing his job weren't mutually exclusive. Chief Engineer Yolanda Reyes kept the Threshold systems running at peak readiness for the entire standoff period, ready to execute any emergency maneuver without a full warm-up cycle. She told me later she'd eaten all her meals standing at her console because she didn't want to be sitting down if something started happening. Dr. Emeka Fatton sat at a communications console and talked to a frightened alien ambassador for 18 hours. He told her stories. He ran out of informational content to exchange early on and started just telling her things. About Lagos, about his family, about the linguistics conference on the moon station where he'd given his first academic paper and been so nervous he'd spoken too fast and had to start over twice. He told her these things partly because the sound of a human voice was probably calming even without full comprehension, and partly, I think, because he was afraid too, and talking helped. Dara stood next to my chair for most of it, not always doing something specific, just present, ready. That's what good officers do. They find the place where their presence is most useful and they stay there. I'm proud of all of them. I'm proud of a lot of things about that 14 days, but if I had to name one, it would be that. 412 people who were scared and who did their jobs anyway and who didn't let anyone down. Part 8. What happened next? I won't tell you the hegemony changed overnight. They didn't. Organizations that large don't change because of a single incident, even a significant one. What happened was more gradual and in some ways more interesting than a sudden reversal. The Ventai incident became known, not just in official records, in the way that significant events propagate through the informal networks of galactic civilization, through trade contacts and diplomatic back channels and the interstellar equivalent of word of mouth. Other species heard about it. Species that had their own histories with hegemony enforcement pressure, their own quietly filed complaints, their own 11 cases. They heard that Earth had sent a fleet. Not because Earth had a treaty with the Ventai, not because there was a strategic interest, not because the math of galactic power balance demanded it, but because 41 people were in a wrecked ship broadcasting into the dark, and humanity had heard them. That information spread. And it changed something, in a diffuse and hard-to-quantify way that diplomatic analysts have been arguing about for 20 years. What it changed was the assumption. The hegemony's enforcement model had always depended on the assumption that smaller civilizations facing pressure were essentially alone, that no one outside their immediate network cared what happened to them. That calling for help was pointless. That assumption stopped being reliable. The hegemony didn't disappear, but they got more careful, more cautious about where and how they applied pressure, because they couldn't be certain anymore that some UN vessel wouldn't be sitting 3 light towers away, listening. I'm not saying humanity fixed galactic politics with one deployment. I'm saying we changed a calculation. Sometimes that's enough. I went back to Earth on leave about 2 months after the threshold returned home. My sister lives in Oaxaca. She has a house on a hillside with a garden that she is extremely proud of, and a dog that has no idea what personal space means, and 2 kids who were 9 and 12 at the time. I stayed for 3 weeks, and I didn't look at the news very often, and I ate a lot of her cooking, and I slept in a room where the ceiling wasn't a fishbowl full of stars. On the second day, my nephew, the 12-year-old, whose name is Alejandro and who is going to be someone remarkable someday, I'm completely sure of it. He found out what I'd been doing in the Vega system. His parents had been vague with him and his sister about it, I think because they weren't sure how much he could handle, but someone at school had apparently mentioned it, and so by day 2, he had looked everything up that was publicly available, and he came to find me in the garden where I was sitting with a cup of actual good coffee and doing nothing useful. He sat down across from me and he said, "Is it true you stayed?" "Yes," I said. "Even with 3 warships?" "Yes." He thought about this seriously, the way 12-year-olds think about serious things, which is without any of the filters adults use to protect themselves from the implications. "Weren't you scared?" he asked. "Of course I was," I said. "Then why didn't you leave?" I thought about Dara standing at my chair, about Emeka talking to a frightened ambassador for 18 hours, about Park at the sensor station, about Ray's eating standing up, about 41 heat signatures in a ship that had been trying to hold its atmosphere together with whatever the survivors could find, about a voice like wind chimes with syntax, saying, "We did not expect you to come." "Because someone needed us to be there," I said. Alejandro turned that over for a moment. "That's it," he said. "That's it," I said. He sat back in his chair and looked at the garden with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone processing something that's both simpler and bigger than they expected it to be. "Okay," he said, "just okay." We sat there together for a while, in the garden with the coffee and the quiet. Epilogue. The threshold was reassigned to a different patrol sector 6 months after the Vega incident. Dara Osai was promoted to full commander and given her own ship, the UENS Patience, a Vanguard-class cruiser, which she has run with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Ensign Park was promoted twice in 18 months, which is unusual, and is now Lieutenant Commander Park, and has a reputation for censor work that the whole Deep Recon community knows about. Emeka Fatnund published 3 papers on the Ventai language in the following year, which were apparently considered foundational in the field, and continued to wear the same 2 sweaters. Chief Ray's retired eventually, and I hear she grows vegetables now, which seems right. Admiral Matsumoto served 4 more years before stepping down. He gave a speech at a galactic diplomatic forum that's been quoted a lot in the years since, though I won't try to reproduce it here. The point of it, roughly, was that humanity's value to the larger galactic community wasn't primarily military. That the fleet was the result, not the cause. That what mattered was the 22 hours before the fleet arrived, the listening, the staying, the work. He sent me a handwritten note after the speech because he is old enough to write handwritten notes, and it said simply, "You set the conditions. Don't let anyone forget that." I still have it. Ambassador Verathis became the Vent High Representative to the newly formed Galactic Independent Species Compact, a diplomatic body that didn't exist before the Vega incident and exists now because of it. It's a loose organization, underfunded and often exasperating, made up of smaller civilizations that have decided that talking to each other is worth doing. She sent me a message about a year after Vega. The message was in English. Not perfect English. There were word choices I wouldn't have made, and at least 2 sentences that worked syntactically but read a little sideways. But they were her words in my language, written carefully. She said, "In our culture there is a practice for the person who stays when others leave. We make a record of them, not of what they did, of that they were present. The presence is the thing we honor. The presence is what changed everything. I have made a record of you," she wrote, "of the threshold, of your people. In our records you are the ones who stayed. That will be true long after both of us are gone." "I wanted you to know," she said. I read it twice. Then I printed it out and put it up on the wall of my quarters, next to the note from Admiral Matsumoto. Sometimes people ask me what the lesson of the Vega incident is. They want a clean one, something that can go on a plaque or in a strategic doctrine document. And I understand the impulse. We want things to mean something clear and useful. The truth is messier than that. Here's what I can offer. A signal in the dark isn't nothing. The person sending it knows it might not reach anyone. They send it anyway because the alternative is silence. Because silence is giving up and they're not ready to give up. Because even if no one ever hears it, the act of reaching out is itself a refusal to accept that they are alone. And if someone hears it, if someone happens to be in the right place, paying attention with the will to act, then everything changes. Not because of the fleet. Because someone heard. Because someone stayed. Because 412 people on a scientific vessel in neutral space decided that 41 frightened people in a crippled ship were worth staying for, even when 3 warships were watching. That's the part I want you to remember. Not the dreadnoughts, not the firepower, not the fleet moving through the Vega system like a mountain deciding to take a walk. Remember the 18 hours before. Remember the fishbowl ceiling full of stars. Remember Dara saying now like she was carrying something made of glass. Remember Emeka talking about a linguistics conference on the moon station to someone, in a dying ship 17 light minutes away. Remember that the signal was sent because someone wanted there to be a record. We were the record. We became the answer. And the answer was simply this: we heard you. We are here. We are not your enemy. That was enough to change everything.